I fear I must go back, Darcy wrote in her notebook that night. She knew she wasn't supposed to. That place had resonated with the darkest parts of her. It was a warning, she knew. But it felt good. "You're going too far," a voice of reason had said, calling to ignorant ears as she continued farther down the hallways, losing sight of herself to the shadows. As much as she hated to admit it, Darcy would do anything to find the answers she sought. It was a drive fueled by pure desperation, hope, a little bit of ego, and at the core, fear. An inferno of blazing fear that burned that bitch day and night. Welcome to Mirrors, a collection of horrors, history, and hauntings. My name is Gabby, and I'm exploring haunted places around my home state of Pennsylvania. Today's episode outlines the complicated and controversial history of what has become known as the shame of Pennsylvania. Here, abuse and neglect ran rampant. Its residents, as they were called, were separated from the rest of the world, left subject to inhumane conditions and unimaginable pain. Today, visitors come here to connect with the people of the past, to offer them a space to tell their stories. This is Pennhurst State School and Hospital. Driving into Pennhurst is always a bit of an eerie experience because you go through these metal gates, and then you're just surrounded by very dense woods, going along these mossy rock walls and other broken down structures that were part of the original campus. Getting here, you drive through all these little towns, and then suddenly you're in the woods, and it's very quiet. It goes to show how Pennhurst was kept so separate from the rest of the world. In 1968, a journalist named Bill Baldini went into the Marriott Hotel across the street from his workplace. There was a conference going on that weekend, and Bill was simply curious about what it was. It was pure coincidence that he met the volunteers of the Main Line Chamber of Commerce, who had been visiting Pennhurst campus. He sat with them as they told him of the abuses they were witness to. Bill was appalled by what he was hearing. He said, "If 10% of what you're telling me is true, I'll do a story about it." Little did he know that this would spark the most important project of his career. Bill was sworn in as a member of the Mainline Chamber of Commerce so he could go with them. He went, not taking any cameras or recording equipment, and was in absolute shock by the sights before him. Suddenly, this potential project held an immense weight. He needed to take cameras in there and document what was happening. Bill and his camera crew were denied entry. Each day they went back, trying again and again to get into the campus. Bill told the superintendent he'd stand outside the gates and tell people what was happening, which he did. The superintendent accused Bill of blackmailing him, and finally, under strict guidelines of where they could go and when they could be there, they were granted access. Since its early history, Pennhurst had been exposed by numerous articles and legislative inquiries. Investigations had even been done when visitors saw unexplainable bruises or cuts on their loved ones. Still, nothing could have prepared the world for what they were about to see. Bill Baldini's report resulted in a 5-part expose titled "Suffer the Little Children." It opens with the promise to document the sights and sounds of Pennhurst. What unfolds is a brutally honest view into the real-life horrors being lived. Viewers were shown images of people chained up and left in adult-sized cages. They saw small, overcrowded rooms, half-clothed children, people rocking anxiously. And then there were the noises, the cries and shouts, and the voices of real people, such as a little boy who said his greatest wish would be to leave Pennhurst. What the camera couldn't capture, though, and what resonated so deeply with Bill, was the smell. The smell that revealed just how deplorable and inhumane these conditions were. People were closely clustered together and often left to sit in their own waste for days on end with no assistance. Members of the camera crew were leaving and getting physically sick in response to what they were seeing. Suffer the Little Children caused a public outcry. People were enraged and demanded change be made. Pennhurst had opened in 1908 as the Eastern Pennsylvania Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic. Its administrators believed that disabled individuals were unfit for citizenship and posed a menace to the peace. The residents were segregated from their communities and forced to live out their days at Pennhurst. Upon their institutionalization, these people were placed into various categories: imbecile or insane for mental classifications, epileptic or healthy for physical, and good, poor, or treated for dental. The chief physician at Pennhurst is quoted saying, "Every feeble-minded person is a potential criminal," which just goes to show the evident hate towards disabled people. And he was one of the people making decisions about how Pennhurst was run. This place didn't close until 1987, and by that time, over 10,500 people had been institutionalized on its campus. I'm sure you're thinking the same question I and so many other people have asked. How was this abuse going on for as long as it was? Honestly, people didn't really know about it. Visitors were allowed to see their family at Pennhurst, although they were only allowed in a small area that was much nicer and cleaner than the rest of campus. Their loved ones would be changed and cleaned up before being brought out by nurses. This place was plagued by secrecy, so people just didn't really know what was happening there. It certainly didn't help that the world was pretty much turning a blind eye to Pennhurst and its residents for most of its history. That leads to another question. Why was this happening? Which is a much harder question to answer, because any answer wouldn't make any sense. This shouldn't have happened. Like Eastern State Penitentiary and Harrisburg State Hospital, Pennhurst was once a progressive institution. It was seen as a solution to the 18th century practice of labeling the sick and disabled as defectives, grouping them together, and quite literally selling them to the lowest bidder. However, a modern viewpoint can obviously see that eugenics was a founding principle of Pennhurst. Eugenics, a deeply prejudiced concept, aimed to improve the gene pool by segregating those with traits seen as unfavorable. Pennhurst took disabled people, primarily children, from their communities to hide them away. There were also ugly laws, which made it illegal for any person who was diseased, maimed, mutilated, or deformed in any way, so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object, to expose himself or herself to public view. Yes, that was an actual law. Doctors often officially prescribed institutionalization. While touring the campus, I heard the story of a mother whose son had been given a prescription for institutionalization. Rather, she wanted to keep him home and care for him herself. He was her son, and the thought of sending him away was devastating. Legal action was threatened against her because her not sending him to Pennhurst was seen as a form of child neglect. Often people wonder how families could send their kids to such a place. This story shows that there wasn't always much choice in the matter. Even so, no one knew how bad it was. At a point in Pennhurst's history, female patients were segregated from male patients to prevent pregnancy. Remember, their main goal was to keep disabled people from reproducing. Once birth control was invented and more readily available, they eased up on the practice of gender segregation. Before it was made illegal in the state of Pennsylvania, over 300 people were even sterilized. Pennhurst had a sprawling campus of over 1,400 acres of land along the Schuylkill River. Also, like Harrisburg State Hospital, Pennhurst was practically self-sufficient. Residents were assigned, or a better word would be forced, to work the farms, do laundry, cook, paint, make mattresses, repair shoes, and more. There's a railroad on campus which would deliver coal and other goods to the campus's power plant. Pennhurst even had its own form of currency. They created this little world, separate from everything else, to keep their people separate from everyone else. Pennhurst didn't equate its residents with everyone else. That's the devastating reality. The Philadelphia Zoo was even spending more per day on its animals than the state was spending on Pennhurst residents. I want to start out by clarifying that Pennhurst, the Pennhurst I'm discussing in today's episode, is Pennhurst State School and Hospital. While it's frequently referred to as Pennhurst Asylum, Pennhurst never actually was an asylum. That's the name of the haunted attraction that is put on at the campus every fall. This distinction is so important not just in terms of accuracy, but because it shows that this was not a place for people to go, receive treatment, and then be let back out to some semblance of normalcy. Pennhurst was a place for mentally and physically disabled individuals, and for most admitted to Pennhurst, that was the end of their connection to the outside world. Because of this, and the fact that most people were admitted as children or even infants, Pennhurst was really all they ever knew. Many souls are attached to Pennhurst today, giving it the reputation of being incredibly haunted. I do want to address the concept of paranormal investigations at places where so much pain and abuse was experienced. I personally go to Pennhurst to try to connect with the people who were there, to learn their stories, or at least to let them know that they're heard and cared for. I love going to haunted places. I'll never deny that that's a fun thing for me. But places like Pennhurst show that there is so much more to all of this, and each investigation must be approached with the utmost respect. My first time on Pennhurst campus was in the spring of 2023 for their annual Paracon. I went with two of my cousins, Sarah and Jaden, who you've heard about before. I'd been to other paranormal conventions before, but I was excited that this one was actually at a haunted location. First stepping onto the grounds of Pennhurst, I didn't know much about the history, and I certainly didn't know the extent of the abuses that happened there. When we got to Paracon, we were able to walk through the Mayflower building. Again, having no idea what to expect, we descended the stairs into the basement. It was pretty crowded, with groups scattered about doing their own investigations. As we passed each group, that group's equipment would go off. One specific group was using an obulus, which spits out words supposedly chosen by spirits. When we passed them, it said Sarah, my cousin's name. We checked, and it was even spelled correctly, without the commonly used H. Back on the main floor, I was hit with a cold spot, which was only the second time I'd felt something like that, the first being on the Gettysburg battlefield. It's weird. It sounds simple enough, like suddenly you feel a cold breeze or something like that. But when it happens, it is so unexpected and unsettling. You truly feel like you are overcome by something otherworldly. And this was one of those end of May days in Pennsylvania that was insufferably hot. After that, we did an investigation at the infirmary. As we were leaving, Jaden pointed to her arm that was, before our eyes, developing deep scratches. There were 3 of them, extending unbroken from her shoulder to the back of her wrist. I'd never seen something like that. We tried to think of a reasonable explanation, but Jaden said she hadn't scratched her arm. I'd been by her side the whole time, so I would have noticed if she was, especially since they were so long and precise. It wasn't like just scratching an itch. She even tried scratching herself intentionally like that, and her nails were short enough that they barely produced red marks, let alone deep scratches. We'd also been really careful to not lean on any walls or furniture, so it's not like she could have gotten scratched that way. For the average person, this would have terrified them enough to never want to go back to Pennhurst again. But for 3 cousins that have this certain chemistry that unexplainable things just happen when we're together, it made us want to go back. It also made us want to learn as much as we could before going back, so we could be as intentional as possible about our next investigation. I'd never experienced a place so active, with such concentrated energy. And that was my introduction to Pennhurst. We went back a few months later in September. This time, our investigation centered around the Candyland room. Located in the basement of the Devon building, which was once a patient dormitory, the Candyland room used to be an occupational therapy room. Its name comes from the fact that it's decorated with Candyland-themed paintings that were likely once playful and imaginative. Today, they, like the rest of the campus, are crumbling. Stumbling across the room in the back corner of the Devon basement is quite chilling, as your flashlight passes over the chip paintings and the toy collections scattered across the patient beds and dirty floor. I had set my flashlight, which is just a typical twist-on, twist-off flashlight, down onto a chair just so I could take my backpack off and get out more equipment. Suddenly, with no one touching it, the flashlight turned on. We asked if someone had done that, and if they did, could they turn the flashlight back off? The light flickered slightly, and then turned out. On command, in direct response to our questions, that flashlight turned on and off repeatedly. Occasionally, it would do that flickering like someone was struggling to twist it the whole way. After a few minutes, the flashlight stopped. It wasn't turning on and off inexplicably anymore, and it didn't for the rest of the night. And also, the room felt empty. Whoever was with us had left. But someone had been there. You could feel them. And they had been urgent in their communication. Desperate, even. The residents of Pennhurst were not heard, and they were given few opportunities to communicate their needs. I found this to be consistent across my own experiences and other encounters I've heard of at Pennhurst. The spirits want to tell their stories, and they want to make their presence known. So, they do so in whatever way they feel able to. On my most recent visit while working on this episode, I had another really cool experience in the Candyland room. I sat in one corner, the other corner is covered by investigators. We had cat balls distributed across the room, which are literally just cat toys that light up when they're moved. Until this night, I had never seen them work. One of the other investigators spoke with such a sweet, gentle voice. She also just had this really motherly aura to her. She'd been the last to come into the room, and as soon as she did, there was a clear shift in the energy. One of the cat balls near her went off. After that, each time she asked a question, the cat ball would go off again. I could have sworn I could actually see them moving. She said, "Okay, honey, I know that one's your favorite, but do you think you could make this one light up?" And she pointed to another cat ball a few feet away. Almost on command, that one lit up. Everyone in the room got really excited, and more cat balls started lighting up. Like the spirit was energized by us knowing they were there and recognizing their communication. This was such a beautiful interaction. It was also interesting, knowing my experience with the flashlight, that the use of motion detecting equipment is consistent. Once I was alone in the Candyland room, I tried speaking with the spirits to see if I could capture their voices. Is there anyone here with me? If there's anyone here, come up and talk into this microphone. My name is Gabby. I'd love to hear your name. Nothing. Perhaps these spirits had a disability in life that prevented them from speaking. Many of the children sent here were deaf or mute. For me, it's further proof of the paranormal that different locations lean into different forms of communication. Let's go back to the Mayflower Building, a former residential building, which is known as one of the most paranormally active spots at Pennhurst. People hear doors slamming, disembodied footsteps, and what sounds like a person getting sick. I'm on the top floor of the Mayflower Building. I'm completely alone in this building, which I don't really understand where everyone else on the tour went, but hey, I am not mad about it. This building was used... Sorry, I was just chased by a hornet. This building was used as one of the boys' dormitories. So walking through, you can see where the bedrooms would have been, the bathrooms, there's a room for lockers. It's interesting seeing the different spaces that made up that person's day and life. To just think like that was their life. Like this was where they were, and that was it. Just really trying to think about that and those boys that were here as I walk through these hallways. Voices have been captured here, saying things like, "I'll kill you, go away," and "I'm scared." There is an anger to the spirits here, rightfully so. Aside from how they were treated in life, I'm sure it's incredibly frustrating to have people constantly going there and talking about the trauma they endured. But this energy could also be because of an infamous spirit known as King. He's protective, demanding, and especially threatening to women. Those who have encountered King have seen him as a shadow figure and smelled cigars. A few investigators have even felt a sensation like they were being choked. Apparently, King was a maintenance man who worked at Pennhurst in the 40s, and the basement is known as his lair. He's mostly felt in the boiler room. I was alone for a lot of my time at Pennhurst during this trip, often even having entire floors or buildings to myself. That being said, I was on edge. I was in a dark basement that had this insanely heavy feel to it, so yeah, I was on edge. But I only felt true fear once, and that was the doorway to the boiler room. I walked up to it, and it felt like someone stopped me in the doorway. I literally felt stuck. And that's when my heart rate picked up, and it just felt like someone was watching me, or hovering over me, and it felt like they hated me. It was the first time I felt something really dark and aggressive like that, and it scared me. I just stood still, and eventually it eased up. I went into the room for a brief moment, got some flash photos, and nothing really happened. However, I did have more activity with cat balls in another section of the Mayflower basement. I'm now in the basement of the Mayflower building. I asked one of the guides what equipment is best down here, and she recommended using anything with lights. So I have my K2 EMF detector set up, as well as a cat ball and the flashlight. So I have this all laid out along the wall in front of me. I'm in a dark hallway all by myself. I can't see anything, but I do have a thermal imaging gun, so that will help me see if there's any changes in temperature or any unexplained anomalies that way. I also got out an app on my phone, which is sort of like the Ovilus, how it gives words, supposedly chosen by spirits. I don't know how legit it is, but I've had some really cool responses, so I always like to just have it out to see if anything comes through and makes sense in relation to my investigation. And in this case, that is exactly what happened. There are definitely some noises coming from the other end of the hallway, but it's really hard to tell
if it's just something with the structure or if it's how voices and footsteps are echoing in here, but still very unsettling to hear noises from the opposite end of the dark hallway. The cat ball's going off, and I can physically see it moving. Oh my God. So my app spiked and said detect. And then it said blue, which is the light of the cat ball. You gotta be kidding me. That was really, really cool. Do you think you could try to make that happen again? If you push that cat ball or touch it, it'll light up for you. Those rarely go off, so I'm really impressed that they did.
Some believe the Mayflower building has an inhuman entity, conjured either as a result of the dark energy in the space or through rituals done by trespassers. The third floor is apparently haunted by a 6-foot shadow figure that hates men and makes them physically sick. Next is the Quaker building, which for years has been described as the building that housed the criminally insane. On my tour, I learned that that is simply not true. People have reported being scratched and pushed here, or have claimed to have things thrown at them. Because of these encounters, it's believed that the people in this building were violent. And I'm not saying that's not true, but the true history just shows that these people were deeply misunderstood. Neglect was a major problem at Pennhurst. It was overcrowded and understaffed, and many of these residents had a lot of needs. Needs that were not being met simply because there was not enough staff. Nonverbal residents tended to express themselves physically, and there were residents who turned to violent behavior simply to get attention. At certain points in Pennhurst's history, rooms had over 50 people with one nurse. Residents who couldn't use the bathroom independently or clean themselves would sit in their own waste for hours or days before being noticed. So people would act out because they had to. It was survival in an incredibly dehumanizing environment. So maybe the activity reported today in the Quaker building is residual, because it's where the patients who acted out physically went.
I'm all alone on the first floor of the Quaker building. This is one of the oldest buildings on the campus, and this is where they housed and cared for residents that resorted to physical harm in order to get attention and get their needs met. So a lot of people report this to be a hotspot or feel nauseous or really uncomfortable in this space.
It's important to note that not all nurses and staff here were evil people who were intentionally neglecting their patients. Not that this excuses the abuses here in any way, but these employees were overworked. And like I said, there just weren't enough of them. The state budget didn't even allocate for the weekends. So a few nurses would go in and volunteer their time just to help residents clean themselves. One nurse shared that she spent holidays with the residents because she wanted them to feel like they had a family. The residents likely experienced some compassion during their time at Pennhurst, but because of the environment, those moments were unfortunately few and far between. Another similarity to Harrisburg State Hospital is that Pennhurst buildings are connected via a network of underground tunnels.
I'm about to go down into the tunnels, which I've never had access to when I was here before, so I'm very excited.
Being down in these tunnels alone in the pitch black was so eerie. I could hear footsteps coming towards me from the end of the tunnels, and they echoed all around me. It was a bright, hot, sunny summer day when I visited. However, as I drove through the woods of Spring City to Pennhurst, dark clouds filled the sky, and it started pouring. Aside from the fact that it's so strange that it seems to storm when I go to haunted places, I'm also telling you this because water was dropping down into the tunnels. That sound, obviously, was not paranormal. But there were footsteps, and they were very distinct from the rain sounds. They'd come a few at a time, and then fade to silence. I went into a stretch of the tunnels under the Quaker building, and at this point I was joined by a few other investigators, so our voices were really carrying down the hallways. It was still eerie being down there and hearing their voices and footsteps, but not being able to really see them because it was so dark. But even with everything going on, I still decided to sit down and try to do some investigating. Like the Mayflower building, The Quaker building also has another male entity who used to be a maintenance worker. His name is Skippy. He too makes himself known, particularly to women.
I'm in the tunnels under the Quaker building, and I heard there was a spirit named Skippy down here. To anyone who may be here, my name is Gabby. I'm gonna sit right here. With this EMF detector next to me that will show me that you're here. If you touch it, it senses your energy. It will light up just like that. I'm also gonna put out an app that will be able to hear the words you say and tell me. My app just said tragic. There were a lot of tragic things that happened here. I'm really sorry. Would you like to tell me your name? You could also sit next to me. Touch either of these pieces of equipment and they'll light up and let me know that you're here. Oh, someone said near you as well. Are you near me? The app just said equipment and then itching and bag. Maybe the spirits are getting overwhelmed by how much is going on. There are some other investigators here and like everyone's voice is just carrying down the hallway, so I can imagine it would be a bit overwhelming.
The last building I investigated was the infirmary, where Jaden had been scratched over a year prior.
I'm in the infirmary and I am the only one in this entire building right now. The one thing about this building is it has a lot of original furniture and artifacts. There's also newer medical equipment that's been added here just as a trigger object, but like some of the bathtubs and hospital beds and sinks and cabinets and those types of things are here.
The infirmary was added to the campus to make Pennhurst even more self-sufficient and separate from the surrounding communities. The nurses who worked here weren't necessarily trained or educated properly for their jobs, which shows how desperate Pennhurst was to create that separate world. People were not being treated properly, and drugs were misused to subdue people into submission. There were even cases of people being administered improper medications and having seizures. Patients who bit would have all of their teeth pulled as a punishment. Bill Baldini's documentary included an interview with Dr. Jesse Fear. Yes, that's his given name, and it's appropriate because of his intimidating, torturous ways. In the interview, he talked about using injections, not for any medical benefit, but to punish and cause the most pain possible. To hear him speak about this, it seems like Dr. Fear found some sadistic enjoyment in causing pain. The final nail in the coffin was Halderman v. Pennhurst, even though it took over a decade to get Pennhurst closed. Terry Lee Halderman, the main plaintiff in the case, had been admitted to Pennhurst at just 12 years old. Terry had lost several teeth, she had a fractured jaw, as well as broken fingers, toes, cuts, scratches, all of which added up to over 40 reported injuries. The case was filed in 1974 on behalf of all former and current residents, and it went to trial in 1977. The Pennhurst Preservation and Memorial Alliance website outlines a few of the main points discussed in the case. It noted the restraints, which were also chemical, meaning drugs were misused to control and sedate people. As for physical restraints, one female patient was tracked to see how long she spent in restraints per month. Between the 4 months noted, she spent an average of 673 hours, or 28 full days, in restraints. In August of 1976, she spent 720 hours in restraints, which is practically the whole month. This woman actually blinded herself, which is just one of many instances of self-harm at Pennhurst. Halderman v. Pennhurst acknowledged that not only was this not an environment that allowed people to improve and thrive, but it was actually causing people to lose the skills they had. Take Terry Halderman, for example. When she was admitted, she was able to say words like mama or dada. She left Pennhurst unable to speak. There was resident-on-resident abuse. A resident once bit off another's ear while they were sleeping. And there was staff-on-patient abuse. Documented cases detail a patient being raped, another thrown across a room, another hit by a staff member who was holding a heavy set of keys. The administration claims that these staff were investigated and fired, although this just calls to question how many similar things were happening that just went undiscovered. The case also stated that those institutionalized there were pretty much trapped. Residents over 18 who had been admitted voluntarily were told they could leave, and those who had been admitted when they were children were told they could make their choice when they turned 18. However, this wasn't exactly true. If a resident wanted to leave, staff could petition to have the person committed by a court ruling. Even if they theoretically could have left, residents had been made to believe their whole lives that there was no other place for them. There was no choice. And again, even if there was a choice, some residents couldn't communicate their desires. The court ruled against Pennhurst, and in 1979, alternative living arrangements were made for school-age residents. For the next decade, the case continued developing, being heard 3 times by the Supreme Court, who kept lowering the court's ruling. It was a long and complicated back and forth to get Pennhurst closed. A settlement was reached in 1986 to close Pennhurst and all other Pennsylvania institutions. Litigation continued, and Pennhurst was officially closed on December 9th, 1987. 1987. Think about that. This was not that long ago. One afternoon, I was telling my neighbor about my podcast. She was just wondering what I'd been up to since graduation. When I mentioned I was getting ready to spend the weekend at Pennhurst, she looked surprised and responded with an, "Oh, I haven't been there since it closed." I was shocked to learn that she was involved in Halderman v. Pennhurst. She was one of the lawyers with Park, an organization fighting for quality education for all kids. They were overlooking Pennhurst and similar institutions, which meant my neighbor had been there when it was open and had witnessed firsthand how residents were treated. We sat together as she told me horrific stories from Pennhurst and other locations. To talk to someone who was actually there, who saw these things happening, was really impactful. As she was talking, she casually mentioned that when going to the courthouse for Halderman v. Pennhurst, she'd gotten a parking ticket. The detail of that parking ticket seems really insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But for some reason, that's when it hit me. This happened. Something as real and mundane as a parking ticket brought all of these horrific stories into focus. It's strange. I'd read about Pennhurst, watched shows and listened to podcasts about it. I'd done a few tours, spent hours exploring and investigating the campus. I knew the facts. I'd heard the stories. And I saw the space where those stories occurred. But something makes us feel so far away from this history. The same thing had happened before, the same realization. In the Candyland room, seeing motion detecting equipment actually move and go off inexplicably. It happened again, writing this episode, reading from my notes and bringing all of my research together. It's that reminder that this place was hell on earth, and there were real people trapped there. Unfortunately, some spirits still seem to be trapped there today, with an overwhelming sadness emanating from the walls of Pennhurst. So it's the next day. I am back at Pennhurst, and I'm actually here now for a photography tour. So it's during the day right now, and I have to say, it's like a totally different vibe here.
during the day. You can still feel the energy, and I would say even more so, like getting to really see every detail, and also being in these rooms that are dark inside, but how the light is falling through the windows and creating these really interesting shadows. I don't know, it's different. It feels like a different place. And I love taking pictures in haunted places. I think that it captures the energy so beautifully. So I'm having the absolute best time walking around here, seeing all these buildings again through my camera, because it really is like seeing it for the first time.
For this recording trip, I did an overnight investigation at Pennhurst. I then went back the next day for a photography tour.
A thunderstorm just came through, so it was raining for a while, and then it went from being really dark outside to really bright, and the light is just changing. So as I'm taking pictures, I'm constantly adjusting my settings to fit that light. And I think that's why I'm able to just see these spaces so differently, is because I'm really working with the shadows to properly capture them on camera. So I feel so much more present here than I did last night, if that makes sense. I feel more connected to this space right now.
You can visit Pennhurst by going to one of their daytime history or photography tours, or their paranormal investigations. I did want to take some time to talk about the haunted attraction, Pennhurst Asylum, which has sparked a lot of controversy in itself. Going to college in Philadelphia, this was actually something we discussed in class, whether it was appropriate to host a theatrical attraction at a place with a history like Pennhurst. A lot of the influential individuals who got Pennhurst closed have come out against the attraction as well. When it first started, the story presented as a part of the attraction reflected Pennhurst, although it poorly separated fact and fiction. Recently, the story has been reworked, telling a tale of asylum patients revolting against an abusive institution. Over half of the performers identify as disabled, and the attraction claims their goal is to give the performers creative control. I don't exactly know how I feel about the attraction, nor have I been to it, but I just wanted to provide more information because I know there is a lot of conversation about it. I will just say, from my experience, I'm impressed each time I'm at Pennhurst by the employees and how they tell the stories with such care and sensitivity. They ground each paranormal investigation in the real history and strictly enforce that each investigator is respectful. Also, the attraction, as well as the tours, raise money for Pennhurst's advocacy efforts and historic preservation. In July, the staff was very excited to share that every building at Pennhurst today is staying there. They had to tear some down, like the Hershey building, for structural concerns. The infirmary was on the chopping block, but it's officially staying. More spaces are being cleaned out and renovated to make sure they are safe to be open to visitors. It's clear that people are continuously fighting to tell the world about Pennhurst. I'll leave you with something that a former nurse told the Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance, which is devoted to bringing awareness to the history of Pennhurst and its modern-day repercussions. She said that a lesser recognized part of Pennhurst's history, yet one that should be acknowledged, is the indomitable and unbreakable power of the human spirit displayed by residents each and every day. These people were made to believe that they had no place in the world, yet they went out and proved everyone wrong. A longitudinal study was conducted by a man named Jim Conroy to review how residents were doing after institutionalization. The study stated that residents were better off in every way we know how to measure. The Alliance's website says that before the relocation of residents, 60% of families of Pennhurst residents opposed the residents leaving Pennhurst. 6 months after relocation, more than 80% of the same families came to agree that relocation had been the best decision. That brings us to the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. It's so hard to believe that we only have 2 episodes left of season 1, but there are so many exciting things to come. I'll be back next Tuesday. Until then, stay spooky. This has been Mirrors, Horrors, History, and Hauntings, produced and hosted by Gabby Hope Frye. Check out the show's Instagram and TikTok at Mirrors Podcast to see pictures and videos from today's episode, as well as other paranormal content. Access bonus episodes and exclusive content by joining the Mirrors Patreon.